Hi everyone, Dr. Whitney Costers, Professor of English, inviting you to join me for a few minutes for a psychoanalytic analysis of Maurice Sendak's very famous story, Where the Wild Things Are. In other words, we're going to determine how psychology is the driving force behind the meaning of this text. And as a reminder to you, this is just one way to interpret this story. It's not the only way to read it, nor may it be the best version for you. But it's always important to understand how other people interpret a story, like what makes meaning for them. Before we get started, please take a minute to subscribe to the channel if you're interested in discussions on writing, classic literature, or just literature that you are likely to encounter in any English class. These videos are designed specifically to inform and help you with all of that. Now, don't let children's literature fool you. Just because it's written for children certainly doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of substantive stuff to analyze and examine. And truly, this story in particular deserves to be understood by all of us, whether you are a child or an adult, because it acknowledges the emotions and the challenges that we all face as young children, children who are too immature to fully understand and cope with our own psychology. It's hard being a kid, right? I mean, hell, it's hard being an adult. And adults have so many more resources to help them resolve their emotional tensions. So this story has earned an important spot in the canon of literature, specifically because it was one of the first children's books to acknowledge, validate, and resolve the emotional frustrations and fears of a young child. And most importantly, it's resolved entirely by the child through imagination and fantasy. No adult is there to help him sort through this conflict, nor is there an adult or a narrator for that matter who moralizes, condemns, or sermonizes to the reader. Now, even though Where the Wild Things was the recipient of the Caldecott Medal after it was published, it also created some controversy because of the depiction of monsters in a children's book was like a new and an unsettling idea. But by the early 1960s, the influence of psychoanalytic views of the human mind and its unconscious on both writers and educators suggested that the real monsters children most need protection from are within and not outside. This is a picture book, and so the pictures in the narrative are meant to complement each other or fill in the gaps of its counterpart. What's significant is that the range of emotions that Max experiences in this story are almost exclusively reflected and therefore identifiable in the pictures rather than in the narrative. For one thing, Max is donning a wolf suit, which automatically associates him with aggression, focus, power, Freud's patient, the wolf man, and the id, the part of our psyche that is associated with impulses, urges, and immediate gratification. In so many classic stories, the wolf is a predator, an animal associated with consuming others. Think like Little Red Riding Hood, the Three Little Pigs, Peter and the Wolf, and of course, Max here who tells his mom he'll eat her up. Let's consider all the emotions that Max experiences throughout this book. Anger, frustration, anxiety, defiance, abandonment, longing, guilt, and loneliness come to mind. And note that we are only explicitly told once how Max actually feels. I mean, he said that he is lonely and he wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. Everything else we must gather from his behavioral choices or appearance. Now, as readers, we're interpreting what we're seeing and reading. That same responsibility rests on Max's mother too, but instead of recognizing and empathizing with the source of his behavior, she reduces it all to a behavioral transgression, calls him Wild Thing, and punishes him for expressing his anger by sending him to his room and refusing him dinner, a symbol of love, care, and nourishment. So now, Max not only must deal with his anger, but he also has to suffer the anxiety, sadness, and bewilderment of the loss of his mother's love and his dinner for the night. In his solitude, Max has time to sleep, think, and imagine. And I think it's really important that we understand that this is a fantasy that he is engaged in. It's not dreaming. This is not an unconscious thing that he is doing. I think that he is very, very conscious of, transforming his reality into something that he can better cope with. Confined to the small space of his room, Max turns to fantasy to fulfill his initial needs to be in control, run, play, and exert his energy. Remember, in the first pages of the book, he was chasing the dog and building a fort. As he imagines where he can be in full control, his space literally grows larger and larger with every passing picture to symbolize his imaginative space, his freedom, and his ability to simply feel and explore his emotions. As he journeys on, the expressions on his face change from aggression to ease. This book is a reflection of the process that we all must go through in order to move from one emotion to the next. And when Max returns to his room at the end of the book, the space is still large and open compared to his space at the beginning of the book. And I think that this is because he has found resolution and contentment for the time being. He has worked through his inner conflicts. So what is this conflict? Well, that might be answered by figuring out what the word wild actually means. In one sense, wild means uncontrollable, impulsive, uncontainable, uncouth. Children of all people are constantly being controlled, told how to feel, how not to feel. And while they do need to learn manners, rules, and social decorum, they also just need the ability to express themselves and be. It's no surprise that children are wild, right? They have all these emotions that they don't quite know what to do with, and they're constantly being told what to do. Really, at the end of the day, Max, like any child, is powerless. Despite his threat to eat his mother up, Max is resigned to remain in his room at the behest of his mother. And this feeling of having no control over his situation, his mother, his dinner, and his emotions is a major source of the conflict. You'll notice that in the story, location is treated pretty generically. All we know is that Max's mom calls him Wild Thing, and so he goes where the wild things are. He's going to find his own kind where he'll be accepted and embraced. So the location may be generic because it's simply imaginary, or because it's so remote and unknown in our consciousness or in our world that it cannot be officially identified. Another way to look at this is to ask, well, where are we our wildest? Where does our id, the part of us that is most impulsive, selfish, and wild, really exist in us? Is it in our imaginations, our thoughts, emotions, brains, fantasies, dreams? I mean, society, rules, parents, laws don't condone any of this. They don't allow us to be wild. I mean, Max is clearly suffering from some sort of anger and frustration that he's manifesting through this umbrella term called mischief, namely hammering nails into the wall, chasing after the dog with a fork, and talking back to his mom, for which he's punished. Like all of us, Max can't ignore these urges and desires. I mean, he has to figure out what to do with them or how to safely act on them in one way or another. So his bedroom transforms into the world where he can travel, explore, and express, but also tame his wildness. To get to the wild things, Max must take a private boat, a boat that has his name on it. I mean, this is all very safe, across the world, through night and day, and in and out of weeks and almost over a year. This suggests that he must get as far away as possible from his mom, his house, and society where rules and restrictions reign supreme. And we all sort of want this at one point or another in our childhoods, I think. We rebel against what's expected of us. And in many cases, that can come in ways that are not necessarily socially acceptable. Notice that once Max arrives to where the wild things are, he's not afraid of any of them. I mean, why should he be? He created these in his head. If you look at the second picture in the book, there's a literal picture of one of the creatures that Max drew hanging on the wall. And in the first picture, Max is dressed in his Wild Things suit, and he's standing next to a tent and a toy that's hanging from a rope, all of which mimic the circumstances that later inhabit his fantasy. The wild things must be of adult proportion and design, too, I think. The more daunting the foe, the greater the eventual triumph when the journey is complete. And these emotions, which children don't quite understand and often need help expressing, can feel so great, so large, they can feel all-consuming. It's no wonder then that Max becomes the wild things king and master. And you might be interested to know that originally Sendak had titled this story Where the Wild Horses Are, but he abandoned that because he said he couldn't draw horses. This version works much better, I think, because it allows us to understand these creatures as symbolic of, or as the personification of, some of the, various emotions that children, that we all feel from time to time. Anger, frustration, anxiety, jealousy, excitement, mania, etc. When you feel these emotions, what are you to do with them when you're as young as 2, 3, 4, 10, 12? As I mentioned earlier, we're often reprimanded for feeling or expressing these emotions, or, they're feelings that we're told to control or ignore. Instead of being punished and confined in his room, Max has invented a world in which he can reign as king of the wild things and tame them simply by staring into their eyes without blinking. And once he has full control over them, he can allow them to let the wild rumpus begin. He and these creatures revel in the wildness, swinging from trees and jumping, yelling, stomping, and dancing around. And even though no specific time frame is given, you'll notice that time is literally spoken of in very vague and generic terms, the way a child would talk about it. The pictures give us clues that Max has been partying with these creatures for days, maybe even weeks. Sometimes the picture reflects daytime, sometimes it's nighttime. At their first meeting, the moon is a waning crescent, but it's full toward the end of their time together. In other words, Sendak gives Max his own version of time that he needs to release his angst in order to focus on reality and the truth. That is, that his mother loves him and bad feelings are temporary. So it's actually Max the King who finally puts the rumpus to an end. This is quite significant, I think. While children and all humans need discipline and structure, we also sometimes just need to let it all out and endure it. I think too often we let things build and build and build until we explode, which is obviously an unhealthy way of managing our emotions. Now, Max eventually just grows tired of the wildness, which is why he puts an end to it. As readers, though, we recognize that this must all come to an end because this tension, once released, no longer affects us so that we can move on to healthier behaviors. But Max does show real power by resolving his conflict on his own without any adults to inhibit him or tell him how to do it. Ultimately, he figures out that the wildness doesn't define his identity. Ironically enough, once he's done with the rumpus, Max, who is now calm rather than angry, assumes his mother's role, punishing the wild things by sending them to bed without supper and powerfully reprimanding them when they, like Max once did, threaten to eat him up if he tries to leave. At the time of their separation, the wild things expressed the same anger toward Max that Max felt toward his mother when she sent him to his room. It's clear that, like Max, the wild things beg him to stay out of fear of abandonment. But Max has resolved his emotional tensions, and so there's no reason to dwell on or feed his past anger and anxiety, which is why he sends the wild things to bed without supper. He has a newfound assurance of selfhood, I think. He's driven by the smell of his hot dinner, a symbol of his mother's love, care, and forgiveness. We're told all around from far away across the world, Max smelled good things to eat, so he gave up being king of where the wild things are. Now, literally, his room is far away from the kitchen, but symbolically, he is emotionally and imaginatively far away from his mom and the world of reality. Clearly, his mother has had second thoughts on Max's punishment and has presented an olive branch, having come to his room, giving him a hot meal, despite initially sending him to bed without one. If you look at the last picture, you'll see that Max Wolfsuit's hood is slightly off of his head, and his expression is one of satisfaction and contentment. This indicates to me that his emotional frustration and anger have been resolved. But the suit isn't off completely. These emotions, while currently managed, will still crop up from time to time, but the idea is that maybe Max is one step closer to knowing how to better manage them in the future. I hope that you found this analysis helpful, and if you did, please check out some of my other videos on a variety of literature for additional help. I hope to see you guys there.